welcome to tonight's Thinking, Should We Stop Flying? I'm Jeevan Vasagar, I'm climate editor at Tortoise. I'm really pleased to be hosting this Thinking tonight because I think it really crystallises one of the sort of central questions about climate change, which is this. What does climate change tell us about the kind of people that we are and the kind of people that we want to be? So we sort of know what the situation is. We know that climate change is already with us, that it's having this enormous impact on the planet. We don't want to see the planet burn. We want to hand this world on to our grandchildren. But we also live on a rainy island, and we'd like to go to a sunny island once a year, maybe twice a year, maybe 4 times a year in some cases. I'm naming no names. But how do we deal with this? How do we resolve this problem? How do we live our values? And how do we do this in a society where fossil fuels are really kind of woven through every part of our lives, from the clothes that we wear to the food that we eat, to every decision that we make, really. And flying, I think, offers us a really good kind of way to think about how we begin to unpick this and how we begin to make the change that we know is absolutely critical in this decade. I'm really pleased to be joined by Kate Hewitt, to my left, who's Policy Director of the Aviation Environment Federation, Anna Hughes, who's Director of Flight Free UK, and online by Andy Jefferson, who's a consultant on sustainability for the aviation industry. Just a note on housekeeping as we begin, which is this is a think-in, so we welcome your thoughts, welcome your comments, and comments really rather than questions, your contribution to this debate. Please just sort of signal me if you'd like to come in on this. And we welcome your comments from the audience at home as well. And again, just sort of signal in the chat if you'd like to come in. I'd like to start by coming to you, Kate, and just thinking about this question of flying. So, I mean, is it kind of blown out of proportion? Because you know, it's something like 2%, 2.5% of global emissions, and yet it's such a lightning rod. It's such a sort of agonised issue. Food and farming is something like 1/3 of global emissions. I mean, should we try and fix food before we deal with flying?
We can't do these things sequentially, I think, is the first answer to that. We have to do everything, and we have to start doing it now. So I'm sure that's true, that in terms of the total global sort of population where the emissions are coming from, it's not primarily from flying. That's largely because the majority of the world's population don't fly. So in any given year, maybe about 4% of the world's population take an international flight at all. About 1% of the world let me get this right, about 50% of aviation emissions are generated by 1% of the global population. So it's extremely skewed in terms of where it's coming from. That is a pattern that many people expect to kind of evolve over time. I think there are lots of countries outside of Europe that would like to be able to increase their aviation activity. In countries like the UK, levels of flying are already pretty high. Even here, about half of the population don't take a flight in any given year. So it's useful to keep this stuff in perspective, because I think for people who do fly and for people who fly a lot, it can feel like such an enormously important, valuable part of their life. Like, it's really hard to imagine doing without it, you know, and it's worth just remembering that lots of people do. The other big problem about flying really is that it's one of those sectors that has almost no technological solutions ready to go that can deliver decarbonisation. So the conversations are all about stuff that the industry and the UK government would like to develop for the future. You know, whether that's electric aircraft, hydrogen power, sustainable aviation fuels, even greenhouse gas removals, which everyone assumes will be needed by the aviation sector. They're just not happening at the moment. So there's an enormous amount of kind of speculation about, you know, what the technologies are going to be in the future. And in that context, certainly we as an organisation will say, look, you can't take the risk on these things. We can't just carry on as we are now and hope that everything falls into place. We have to start cutting emissions now from all sectors, including flying. Okay,
there's a lot in that answer, Kate. And I think I'd like to come back to the point you made about the rest of the world and the demand from the rest of the world later in this conversation. But I'd like to pick up first on the technology point and maybe turn to Andy, who I think is joining us virtually, I hope is joining us virtually. And come to you, Andy, and ask you whether we can tech our way out of this crisis. Is there a technological solution to the flying problem?
So firstly, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to be here. Straight answer to your question is yes. I would encourage people who haven't come across this yet to visit the Sustainable Aviation website, sustainableaviation.co.uk. We're a coalition of the UK aviation industry, but we sit across airlines, airports, manufacturers of aircraft and engines, and also air traffic control. I think, firstly to say, look, absolutely, aviation needs to tackle this climate issue, and we're in this with everybody else in having to get carbon off the table and getting ourselves to a stable position. What I would say is, and disagree slightly from where Kate was perhaps positioning the situation, in that there aren't really any technology solutions. They're not ready to go. They're not happening. There's absolutely masses happening across airspace modernisation. Here in the UK, we introduced something called free route airspace, which means aircraft can fly in straight lines and optimum efficiency last year. That alone was reducing emissions equivalent to 3,500 homes every year of CO2 production. In addition to that, we're looking at how we can switch to the next generation aircraft, the electric aircraft, the hydrogen aircraft. There were some really interesting reports recently published through the Aerospace Technology Institute, a Fly Zero program. Some amazing concepts there of hydrogen aircraft. Airbus, one of the major manufacturers, looking to introduce those aircraft into service from 2035. So that's only just over 10 years away. What we're looking at now is the immediate, what do we do today, tomorrow, in the next 5 years? And that's where things like sustainable aviation fuels. Now, these are fuels where you can take a bag of landfill waste that we're throwing out and having a problem to deal with today. We can turn it into jet fuel and recycle it. Linking that with carbon capture at the production site, we actually produce sustainable fuels that are 70% less carbon intensive than the fossil fuels we're using today. So there's lots of solutions. I'm not disputing anyway the challenges that there will be in terms of scaling those solutions up, and in terms of getting that to a point that we're having a dramatic reduction and change in emissions from flying today. But to say we haven't got solutions, I think is a little unfair. And I think in terms of the way we see it as an industry, the problem here is absolutely carbon, and we recognise if we don't solve the problem that flying becomes a real problem for society in general. What we would say is, look, we think we've got a solution to take the carbon off the table. So as long as we do that, we don't see a reason why you should be saying don't fly. So I suppose that's our thoughts for now, but happy to come back on any detail.
Andy, thank you. Just to zero in on one point. So you talked about a hydrogen plane by 2035. Isn't that a bit like the builder saying your patio will be done for £5,000 in 2 months? And 2035 itself is a long, long time away when we have to cut emissions sharply this decade. So, I mean, do we really have a working technology that we can turn to now? And if so, what is that?
So a company called Zero Avia test flew a hydrogen aircraft here in the UK last year. They're working out in the Cotswolds on a 19-seater version of that plane that they're planning on flying, test flying later this year. They're expanding that quite quickly now, doing some work out in the States as well. Airbus's test program is looking at using one of their older A380s, the big double-decker 4-engine long-haul plane, and using that as a hydrogen test bed. So I think the thing I would say is, I absolutely get it all feels a bit like jam tomorrow, and look, we've got a crisis today, and we've got to stop flying today. The issue we've got with aviation is, if you stop flying today, you take all the money out of aviation to be able to invest in developing the solutions. And the other thing, to be quite frank, is if we stop flying in the UK today because we're enlightened and we're concerned and we're going to take direct action, that's great. Aviation emissions from the UK represent, I think, on average about 0.1% of global emissions. So the problem then becomes, if we do that, who else will do that? Will they all do that? Or will they just say, actually, if you want to stop flying in the UK, fine. We're not in India, we're not in somewhere else. So it's also about working globally, working across all of those areas to inspire these improvements and these future generations. And I think you look back 100 years ago plus, we didn't even have an aviation industry. There's been a lot of great UK pioneering innovation and expertise that's got us to where we are today. I've got quite a lot of confidence in those people and what they can do going forwards from what I've seen. But I accept that might feel a bit overly optimistic or ambitious from those who are less close to the detail.
I can see a few themes emerging here, and I want to come back to Kate in a moment on the technology point. But before I do that, Anna, let's talk a bit about the behaviour side of this and the sort of personal side of this. So you've given up flying yourself, is that right? And can you just tell me a bit about that decision? When did you give up flying?
So about 12 years ago, I decided I wasn't going to fly anymore. And that was the
furthest you'd flown at that point?
I'd been to New York, so
Okay.
that was the furthest I'd flown at that point. All the other flights I'd taken were short haul to various places in Europe, including Jersey, where my sister lives. And it was all part of keeping my carbon footprint as low as possible. So I've always been environmentally minded, and as I kind of learned about my place in the world, I realised all the different things that I could and should be doing to reduce my emissions. I think we all have that kind of environmental awakening, don't we, at some point? And for me, it was 2009, that I watched a particular film which kind of really turned on a switch in my head, and I thought, well, once you learn fact, you can't unlearn them. And I thought, well, flying has to go. And that kind of...
Are there moments like, with vegetarians and bacon sandwiches, do you in February, do you suddenly start scrolling through flight websites?
This is interesting, actually, because I think, so I'm also vegan. The bacon sandwich doesn't do much for me. And this is, it's very true that when you make a decision, your tastes change very quickly to accommodate that decision. Right. So I resisted being vegan for a long time because of cheese, right? And most people will say that, I'm sure. And when I stopped eating cheese, I just didn't think about cheese anymore because it wasn't in the fridge. The same thing has happened with flights. Because flights are just not an option, I simply don't think about them. So I do think about the things I can still do, like travel by boat, travel by train, travel by bicycle. I do a lot of cycle touring, travel by coach. I can still travel internationally. I can still go to anywhere I want. I could even go around the world if I chose to, if I had the time and the desire to do that. But it's about that, it's not a sacrifice. It is a choice. It's a really positive one. It's not just good for the planet. And I do feel good that I'm making these decisions for the good of future generations. But I also feel good in myself because traveling over land, for example, is so much more of an enriching experience. I'm thinking of a train journey I took to Copenhagen a few years ago, which was... it wasn't just getting on a plane and landing in Copenhagen. It was traveling through Europe and hearing people talk in their own languages on the train and slowly, steadily morphing from England to Denmark, landscape-wise, culture-wise, language-wise, all of that stuff. And I think that's such an enriching experience that you don't get with air travel. And for me, that is very important, and it's kind of a personal boost as well as a boost for the planet.
So I think the parallel with veganism is really interesting if we think about this in terms of the population, because my sort of hunch on this in terms of veganism, in terms of diet, is that most people in Britain will not ever be vegan. But there is something to be said for persuading people to give up meat. The idea of meat-free Mondays, I think, is quite popular, and especially encouraging, schools and hospitals to say, let's put more veggie meals on the menu. Let's take meat off the menu one day a week. So, what would your ask be if you were going to say to people? Do you say to people just stop, just don't fly?
There are so many parallels here. It's such a good example with the analogy with diet. Lots of it is down to choice. So we tend to book flights because we think that's the only option. And if you realise that there are other options, it's like a menu. If you have a vegan option on the menu, you're more likely to choose it than if you don't. So it's having those other options available. It's also, there are certain people who will make a choice of their own volition because they have information that makes them decide that that's the right choice to make. for other people, they'll need that kind of regulation. So in terms of aviation, how about we take away the flight routes where there is a direct train, for example, London to Edinburgh, right? That's the busiest flight route in the UK. And you can do it it's no quicker to fly. You might think it's quicker because it says, it's a 45-minute flight or whatever it is, but that's not the journey time. And in fact, there have been quite a few races. In fact, just before the COP climate conference last year, there was a race by, I think it was the Campaign for Better Transport did it. And one person flew and one person took the train, and they arrived within 10 minutes of each other. There is no saving in time when you're flying domestically if there's a direct rail route. So wouldn't that be great? If we removed that flight route, we simply wouldn't be able to take it. That's what they're doing in France with some of the flight routes.
When you say remove it, what does that mean?
So we just can't fly from London to Edinburgh anymore. We will take the train instead.
No, but what's does that mean increasing taxes so it's uneconomic?
Oh no. So that would actually be the government would make this as it would be regulation. So that and this is what's happened with the French government. There are 3 routes. I think there were a long list that they could have done, but 3 routes they decided in the end. Okay, there is a direct train which takes less than 2.5 hours, so we're not going to have this flight route anymore. I'm
just curious to ask Andy how often he flies, and whether Andy, if you think about reducing the amount of flying that you do.
So I probably don't fly as much as you think. I certainly haven't, obviously, during the pandemic, but 3-4 times a year, if I'm honest. Probably 1 long haul trip, 3 short haul trips. Depends, and I'd say probably most of those short haul trips are business, long haul trips probably leisure. So I think in terms of the kind of thoughts about stopping flying, and certainly kind of, let's say, stopping flying, going on a train where it's available. I look, everybody's entitled to their opinion, and choose to do what they want to do. I wouldn't stop anybody that wanted to explore a land journey between 2 destinations rather than getting on a plane. But what I would say is, if you're making that decision because you're worried about the carbon in the atmosphere, and if we get to a point where we're not putting carbon in the atmosphere, would you change your mind? Would you say, actually, that problem that stopped me flying has now gone away, therefore I'm going to revisit that conversation? Because that's a genuine vision of the future that certainly we see in the industry, where you'd be looking at a journey between London and Edinburgh that doesn't create any carbon. So
for managing demand in the short term. So if we've got this idea that by the 2030s we'll have the tech, do we need to manage demand now to bring emissions down?
So personally, and from my point of view in the industry, we don't think you do need to do that. There's a range of things that we're doing in the industry right now. So we're part of the emissions trading scheme, the EU system, the new UK system that started this year. Take EasyJet and British Airways, 2 of the big operators on a London-Edinburgh route. Both are providing those flights for net zero, so they're effectively offsetting those emissions and investing in carbon removal and other solutions to do that. From my point of view, my sort of moral code, I'd say that's okay. Other people, I'm sure, would absolutely say, I'm not happy about that, I'm not getting on the plane. But I think people should be able to make that choice rather than say, we're not even going to let people have that choice.
Can I come back on that? Yeah. Just very briefly. Andy does talk about climate change as if it's an opinion, which it isn't. We already have far too much carbon in the atmosphere. Any extra emissions are putting life on this planet at risk. So, it isn't an opinion. It's scientific fact. We must slash emissions. What Andy was talking about earlier about the 10-year readiness of this technology, and then we can talk about technology in more detail later, but we've been given the code red warning. It was 12 years until climate breakdown, irreversible, and that was 2 years ago already. Like, we don't have time. I want to just raise one more point about the behaviour change thing. So my organisation, Flight Free UK, we run a pledge which says, could you take a year off flying? So our point and our view is not, we should all stop flying. That's unlikely to happen anyway. Same as veganism. We're not all going to go vegan. But enough people doing it raises enough awareness that we have that kind of cultural shift. And yes, it's not practical to stop all flights right now. but we really do encourage people to give it a try. If you can kind of set yourself a challenge, could I take 12 months off flying? And then you realise what the alternatives are, and you think, okay, yes, my now longer term behaviour is going to be to reduce the number of flights to, let's say, one long haul every few years, not one long haul a year. That's way too high. We're busting through our carbon budget. That's too much.
So maybe a way of resetting ourselves. Kate, I'd like to come back to you on the technology point. So Andy was very upbeat on the prospects of new technology. Do you share that optimism? I'm guessing from the sort of furrowed brow that's a no.
I think that it's quite telling that the example that Andy gives of the kind of flight that might decarbonise first is a domestic flight. And so is a journey that, you know, as Anna said, we could already do by rail without, you know, using renewable electricity. So that's, you know, there will probably be a role for decarbonised domestic flight, you know, between the UK and Ireland, for example, but it will have a very small dent in terms of the total impact of the aviation sector. And this is one of the problems with the technology, that even if we start getting things like, you know, zero carbon sort of flights from hydrogen in the mid-2030s, for example, that they're likely to be small aircraft flying relatively short routes. The UK government loves the idea of aviation technology. You know, they've got this whole, everything you say about aviation and climate change has to be called Jet Zero these days. There's a Jet Zero Council, we've got a Jet Zero policy strategy and all of that. And so they've pushed the numbers really high in terms of, you know, possible sort of future technology rollout from aviation. And they now reckon that in their high ambition scenario, you could get more than 25% of flights zero emission by 2050. Even so, the total impact of those flights on emissions is about 2% reduction. It's tiny because of the fact that they're likely to be short routes, you know. So it's really important to keep these kind of issues in perspective. You know, yes, we have to get new technology rollout. It should be coming faster. It should have happened decades ago. It hasn't happened because the industry hasn't had to pay for its emissions. They've had no financial incentive to do this. So they've just carried on burning fossil fuel because it's much cheaper. So yes, absolutely, we need policy drivers to speed up the pace of technology change. But we also need to be realistic about what can be done in the space of 30 years. We've got, you know, 2019, just before the recession, we had the highest ever level of aviation emissions in the UK, despite the fact that, you know, this is a topic that's been talked about for decades, you know.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that that came up in the discussion, a point that sort of both Anna and Andy were sort of making from different points of view. Anna used the language of taking away something, taking away a route between London and Edinburgh, and Andy talked about choice. And I think that that's a sort of fear that people have, isn't it? That firstly, that you know, climate, you know, our response to climate change involves kind of wearing some kind of hair shirt, and secondly, that the state needs to be more intrusive and will become more intrusive and will take away people's choices. How do you respond to that? And I mean, if someone says to you, well, you know, isn't this just, you know, a nanny state kind of reducing my options? I mean, what, you know,
yeah,
what's the?
I understand that, and just so you know, the response to climate change is wearing a charity shop dress. So it's
Absolutely not a hair shirt.
Not a hair shirt. Yeah. So, like I said earlier, some people will be able to make those choices. They'll have the means, they'll have the information, and that can have a huge impact. You know, again, back to veganism, like the reason that Subway provides a vegan option is because people demand it. Not very many people, but it's a trend, it's being responded to by industry. Same thing with aviation. In Sweden, before the pandemic came along and skewed all the stats, there was a 9% drop in domestic flight bookings in Sweden in 2019, which is remarkable because every other country in the world that has an aviation industry, it was rising. Okay, and that's a result of consumer awareness, and industry responds to that. Whether it is speeding up the use of unsustainable fuels. Sorry, Andy. So what I mean is sustainable aviation fuel is not sustainable. There are many reasons why not. We can go into that later as well if you want. But there are certain people who won't be making that free choice, and we are at the stage of climate breakdown, and we're up against it so much that we need to have those regulations in place to bring the other people around. So there are people, let's say frequent flyers, and to be classed as a frequent flyer, you only need to take 3 return flights a year. So, you know, the trouble with calling people frequent flyers is no one thinks it's them. Everyone knows someone who flies more than they do, right? But yeah, in order to bring that number down, it is about removing those reward schemes. Why do we reward people for flying a lot? This is nonsense, and so it should be that kind of regulation and taxing aviation fuel, making the whole thing more expensive generally, reducing the cost of the alternatives, and simply removing some routes. A halt on aviation, on airport expansion. All of these things are rules that could come in place now to regulate that kind of the high emitters. And yeah,
this is a really interesting point. I want to come on to some of these questions about how we change the system or how we rethink the system. But first, there was a question from a gentleman in the audience.
Yeah, do I need a mic?
I can get you a mic. Yep. And if you'd just like to say your name before you come with a question or comment.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Praha. Yeah, just in response to the couple of points that you've just made. Obviously, this is a global problem. Everyone in the world has to kind of respond to it. So I think 2 of the points, one that you made is, you know, we could all take a year off from flying or doing long haul flights, that being 1, and 2, some sort of tax to make flying more expensive. And, you know, my response to that would be, to someone, you know, the world generally in the past 30, 40, 50 years has gotten richer. So to someone in, let's say, India, who's just able to start taking long haul flights, is that fair to suddenly tell them you can't take one every year? Whereas, you know, I'm very privileged, I've been able to take one every year my whole life. You know, is it fair to tell someone like that, your flight's suddenly going to be way more expensive and you can only get one every 3 years? I know I'm not allowed to ask questions, but a discussion on that would be interesting.
Yeah, we'll certainly come back to this point about fairness in a moment. But just to say that the tortoise that you can see advancing across the screen has reached its halfway point. So we're just going to take a break for a couple of minutes, a slowdown, a chance to make a cup of tea if you're at home, and a chance to turn to your neighbours and introduce yourself if you're in the room. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Recently moved into this, into tortoise.
those price increases will come through carbon markets, to be honest. Yeah, it's a funny one. This UK ETS is like...
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks, everyone. So welcome back to the Thinking on Flying. And a question that I'd like to come to next, just to think about what... if we think this is a system that ought to change, or if some of us think there's a system that needs to change urgently, what are the levers, what are the ways in which we can bring change? And obviously tax is something that's talked about a lot. It's very, very difficult to tax aviation, or it has been very difficult to tax aviation. Kate, can you give us a sense of how that's come about and how we are where we are today?
Yeah, so it is true that it would be difficult for the UK to decide today to impose a tax on fuel for international travel to every country in the world. And it's because of the fact, it goes back to the Second World War and the fact that after the war there was an agreement, the Chicago Convention, that everyone was going to be much more open to each other. We were going to trade with each other. Everyone was going to be friends and understand each other. It was done for good, with good kind of moral purpose. But ever since then, there have been these, there's this whole kind of plethora now of kind of legals that would need to be renegotiated to allow for some of those kind of taxes. It's not to say it can't be done, but it's a little bit complicated to do. Personally, I think that ensuring that I suppose the carbon cost of flying is internalised into ticket prices can potentially be done through other means, potentially through carbon markets, through other kind of mechanisms that would be easier to implement and maybe even more effective.
The point that you made there, sort of in passing almost, about flying being something that opens up the world, is that an important part of the sort of defence of aviation? I mean, how, particularly for island nations, more countries that are more remote from big population centres, is there always going to be a need for some aviation to keep the world connected? I mean, what do you think is a good outcome here?
Yeah, I think that it's very hard to imagine a world, in the next few decades with no flying. I absolutely have heard, serious scientists say that if we want to achieve net zero, then that's what we should be talking about. That maybe we should wait until we've got these, zero carbon flights that can go long distances, but that won't be till after 2050. And between now and then, we need to be kind of closing things down. I think that's going to be very difficult. I think that, I can't remember what the first part of your question is. Undoubtedly, aviation brings people benefits. It'd be foolish to say it doesn't. Yeah. That's not a reason why we should carry on growing the aviation sector without limit. We can have a look at the flights. What do flights bring us? Are there other ways that we can get those benefits? Can we go on holiday to a nearer destination and still enjoy being on the beach? Does it all have to be about mode shift, or can we do things differently? Can we lock in some of those kind of benefits in terms of reduced business travel that we've seen during the pandemic, for example? So there are lots of useful things that we can do without having to say, the world has to stop flying.
Okay, I'd like to talk about business travel in a moment, but I want to come to Andy on the economics of this first, if I can. Andy, could you give us a sense of what the economic case for aviation is? And there's a sort of almost a kind of diplomatic case for it, a kind of an idea that it sort of brings countries together, but it's also a really important factor in terms of investment, in terms of jobs, as well as give us a sense of what you think about that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, here in the UK, pre-pandemic, 550,000 jobs directly employed in the aviation industry. That's across all the various sectors, about 1 million when you take into account the indirect jobs that are provided supporting aviation, tourism, etc. And obviously that's creating huge economic value across thousands of companies across the UK, and supporting economy. In terms of taxation, aviation was providing pre-pandemic just under £4 billion of tax revenues to the UK Treasury through the air passenger duty. Economically, we're a big hitter in terms of that contribution. Globally, that scales up from there. I don't have the figures immediately to hand, but happy to kind of provide them after the meeting. And they're available. You can find them through people like the IATA, the International Air Transport Association. There's a Benefits Without Borders publication they did recently on this. Range of economic values, and obviously I think from an aviation point of view, through pandemic, providing all those kind of cargo emergency supplies of PPE, we could have done it by ship and train and boat, but they wouldn't have got there as quick, and it would have been a bit more of a challenge. I mean, I think the other thing I just wanted to kind of point I wanted to make at the moment is kind of just to share with you, I suppose, how I see things. I mean, I work regularly day in, day out with hundreds of people across the industry who are as passionate and as concerned as many people maybe in the audience, and certainly Kate and others around the climate change issue and wanting to solve it. What I'd say may be different is they've taken a view of, look, rather than kind of sitting there and deciding actually the way out is to stop flying, they've taken a view of let's get stuck in and find a solution and work with the industry to do that. We've got biological chemists, scientists looking at the hydrogen technology solutions and a range of other things that are trying to fix that problem right now. And I suppose my view is actually let's encourage them, let's give them a go, because this feels a really important thing to fix, rather than just to stop and not do.
Do you think paying more taxes could be part of the aviation industry's economic contribution?
I think the aviation industry is absolutely open to the view that we should be paying, the carbon price should be reflected in the ticket price. I think that's where we're going. I think Kate referred to that as well, and I'd agree with that. So, for instance, switching away from fossil fuels to these sustainable aviation fuels, 70-80% life cycle carbon saving could go up to 100% life cycle carbon saving when you include captured carbon, renewable energy, and green hydrogen, for instance, to make jet fuel in the future. That obviously will, at the moment, is coming at a cost that currently is about 3 to 5 times the cost of fossil fuel, and there'll need to be a way to level that price. Let's face it, there's going to be a cost of that imposed. There's already an option for people to pay to offset their carbon. Unfortunately, not many people are voluntarily opting into that. From the feedback the industry is getting on that, but there's certainly a desire to do that. EasyJet made the move to provide that voluntarily and pay for it by themselves. So I think these things will happen, and we're accepting it. And in the latest roadmap we did in sustainable aviation, we all automatically assumed that by adding that price into it, you do end up with a reduction in rates of future growth, because you're making effectively flying a little bit more expensive. But actually, the key thing is focusing, from our point of view, is focusing the investment that then brings into the system, if you like, to support the decarbonising solutions. So whether that's carbon removal, new technology aircraft, or sustainable aviation fuel.
I'd like to come back to UK on offsets in a minute, but first to come to Anna.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm really pleased that Andy said that I would like to see the carbon price reflected in the price of the ticket. That would be a fantastic policy. And that would mean that my Mediterranean holiday in Nice, which I went to before the pandemic, the train journey would be 10 times cheaper than the airfare.
Yeah.
Who would then choose to fly, right? And he's right, it would reduce demand significantly, because the train, by taking the train in near Europe, you save 90% on your emissions. That is not insignificant when we're facing a climate crisis.
In terms of the kinds of air travel that have an impact on climate, do you think we should differentiate between different kinds of air travel? So, business class versus sort of budget air travel. I mean, are airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet actually the greenest airlines, because they pack lots of seats in, and they try to sell all their tickets and fill their cabins? I mean, is there a serious differentiation here, or are they all the same?
Yeah. So Michael O'Leary will tell you that not EasyJet, Ryanair. Sorry, Ryanair is the greenest airline in Europe. because they fill exactly what you just said. They don't have business class, so they only have economy class and they fill their planes. Ryanair is also in the top 10 emitters in Europe, and all the other 9 are coal-fired powered stations. Right, you can't be in one list and then the greenest. There's no such thing as green aviation, right? Yeah, but yes, there are lots of reasons why we fly. There are lots of different reasons. It's difficult to say that one reason is more important than another because, you know, maybe the person who, or the family who works hard all year and wants to have their break in Tenerife will say that their flight is more important perhaps than the businessman who's on a plane every couple of weeks, you know, but so it's really tricky to look at what's more important. But
it's easier to substitute business travel for
right, exactly,
for remote calls,
yeah.
right?
But it's also easy to substitute holidays. So yes, Tenerife is lovely, but so is Mallorca, and you can get there by boat very easily. Well, not very easily perhaps, but more easily than Tenerife anyway. We also have, you know, the Isles of Scilly. What a wonderful location that is. Some phenomenal holiday destinations are available without flying. Let's just remind ourselves that our most flown to location is Spain. It's right there. You know, we can, especially if we live in London, we can easily get a train, a boat, a coach to a location in Spain.
Let me come to a question from the audience, the gentleman in the suit.
Yeah, it's a comment on just on framing. So we've talked a lot about the consumer, and I think, you know, there's an interesting paper out this week saying how nudge has been a bit of a big distraction from system change when it comes to certain crises. And I just wonder if we could frame this perhaps around investment and investors. So I run an investment company. We invest in some of these fuels, and I know the difficulties of it because my pension is invested in those, and there are ups and downs of trying to convert energy from waste, for example. But I think the key bit here is, do we sort of distract ourselves by the idea this is all about consumer choice, and we get into these endless arguments about who should make the choices and who shouldn't. This is system change. So the people who own the planes are not the airlines, it's the banks. They're leased. Nobody owns a plane that flies an airline, otherwise he wouldn't make any money at Ryanair. So it's your bank that owns the plane. Your pension is flying that plane, is paying for it, and is paying for the technology that enables it. So in a way, we've got a lot more power than just our consumer choice. And yet we always frame this, and it gets framed as if people want this or don't want it as we're sitting there in front of the shelf. But actually, we're paying for it. We're building it. And we have some control over how that happens. But we don't use that. So, you know, millionaires, I think the survey this week, millionaires worrying about how much they're using their flush toilets, for God's sake, when their pension is sat there in JP Morgan. So, you know, the biggest emitter on the planet, right? Because they're the guys who finance this stuff. This stuff doesn't happen without money. It's money that makes planes fly, not fuel. It buys the fuel, it builds the planes, it enables the system that makes this all work. And we have some control over that. But the more we kind of push the finance bit away because it looks a bit scary and technical, the more you give the power to someone else to make that decision. And I think, you know, we haven't mentioned the money here, but it's money that makes planes fly. And if the money switches off, the planes don't fly. So, and you will have that power in terms of that money. And so I think, you know, I think there's a danger that something like flying is used totemic to say there's nothing we can do about climate change. I don't disagree. Likewise, I don't want to fly anymore. I run a green investment company. I'd be an idiot to do that. But I think the point there is we also need to take control of the other levers that we have, which are ultimately a lot more powerful. And I think, you know, we shy away from that and fall into this trap of saying it's about consumer choice. And that's on many things. So I think transport is, don't just pick on flying. Why are trains so crap, right? Do we choose planes because trains aren't very good a lot of the time, right? And because we don't invest in them enough, right? We don't prioritize it. I'm investing in EV charging. You know, is that the right solution for cars? Maybe it is. Maybe EVs aren't. You know, these sort of things. But we get into these very technical discussions, which I think can be a matter of opinion about hydrogen. For example, I got lost in that world when I invested in a hydrogen green bond, right? And then I found out a lot of stuff I didn't really want to then find out because it makes your life hard. And I think that's the bit. We've got this power, but being a consumer doesn't give you any power. It just gives you choice.
Yeah, a really, really important observation. I think there are two things that I'm sort of thinking about kind of listening to that. And one of them is, I think Sweden came up in this conversation, as it often does in these conversations. But I wondered if there, I mean, Sweden might be the place you look to, but are there other countries around the world that are doing a better job of rethinking their systems? Kate, if I could come to you on that. And the other sort of point that I was thinking about from that was, you know, is it really luxury that we need to sort of make us cut through? So is it the sort of Tesla model of getting us to sort of give up our cars because there's this amazing electric car that we want to take? So is it the same with sort of, you know, luxury travel? Does it have to be very, very beautiful for us to adopt it? But Kate, first on the sort of system point, you know, are there other countries that are really modelling a different future?
I don't know what Sweden's doing, to be quite honest, apart from the fact that I suppose that, you know, there was that little pocket of Europe where this idea of the kind of flight shame movement originated, didn't it? And that absolutely is still sending ripples, I believe, through the aviation industry. I think the idea that you know, fundamentally, actually choosing to fly today comes with some kind of moral penalty, I think, was sort of shocking for people working in the industry.
On a system level, you've got the rise of night trains.
Okay, go on.
And that's happening across Europe. So
the other thing I was going to say, there is a Swedish company who I think is doing really well in terms of, so there are an increasing number of big businesses that are making commitments to cut their emissions from their own corporate travel kind of by 2025, short-term stuff, recognising that their own air travel it stands out in terms of that company's own kind of net zero commitment. So you've got consumers in terms of individuals choosing to go on holiday and where they do that. You've got the investor piece, you've also got kind of business decisions, and I think that could be potentially quite powerful in terms of what the government feels kind of it has license to do in terms of policy. But go on, you know more about Sweden than me.
Just that you've seen, especially since now things are opening up again after the pandemic, there is good investment in pan-Europe night trains, which are a fantastic way to travel, you know. You can get to your holiday destination while you sleep. Definitely take an eye mask and earplugs though, otherwise you won't sleep. But yeah, I mean, that's a good example, I think, of where trains are actually good. So yeah.
And the point that was made earlier by Andy, he touched on the point of about offsets and saying, you know, that is a way that you can sort of deal with the emissions from your flights. And I, you know, I think there are lots of questions about offsets and how well regulated this market is. But there are also a lot of people who feel that they can do this on a sort of personal basis. That we can you know, if we eat so many vegetarian meals, we can afford to take a flight. You know, so what do you think of that kind of thinking? I mean, is that sort of magical thinking really about the climate? You know, how should we think about this?
Yeah. So you know, to sort of put these things in perspective, I hope I get the numbers right, because Anna will tell me if not. But I think that taking a single long-haul flight, well, that if you were to choose not to, if you're someone who flies and you choose to not take that flight, that return flight, that would save about the same amount of emissions as going vegan for a whole year. So, you know, in terms of these individual lifestyle choices, no, you can't just say because I've cut down on my meat consumption that the flight becomes okay because of the fact that the emissions from, you know, that individual flight can be so high. I think the other thing that's important to say about offsetting, Andy mentioned the fact that most people choose not to buy an offset. I think that's not because people don't care about climate change. I think it's because people recognise that most offsets are quite dodgy, and that for most offsets, what you're paying for is not something that will remove an equivalent amount of CO2 from the atmosphere as your flight. You're in most cases paying for an emissions avoidance in another sector. So, you know, whether that's, you know, investment in these sort of cook stoves or, you know, a sort of speeding up renewable energy, all those good things to do, they need to happen as well as getting to net zero aviation. We can't have one or the other.
Okay. I want to bring in two comments from the audience. First, the lady in the orange.
I've got to try and remember my point now. I'd say, what would be your thoughts on maybe putting a cap on people's air travel? So potentially, I don't know, you can take one short-haul flight every year, or every 3 years you can take one long-haul flight. And so my dad is Australian, which unfortunately means that most of my family are in Australia, and I would be willing to sacrifice, say, 3 years of not going abroad if that meant that I could then see them. And I also think that might offset sort of the negative kind of unintended side effects of saying, oh, if you want to emigrate to a different country, then you're going to have to sacrifice seeing your family. And I don't, just a discussion to be had around maybe you have this limit and then you've got a premium that you pay above that, which is, would imagine it would impact maybe people in businesses who are flying for business and flying more frequently throughout the year. And it could be a massive premium that would maybe allow it to still be kind of affordable to the average consumer and wouldn't stop people from doing that, but would maybe put it into the hands of the wealthy.
Really, really interesting observation. I just want to take the comment from the man in the blue jacket as well.
Hi, I'm Stephen Beer. I would follow on from that because I think we haven't really been talking so much about consumer choice as deciding that the consumer is making the wrong choice. So surely the logical extension is to give everybody a carbon budget. We have the tech that can do that pretty much, and everyone can make their own choices. I mean, unfortunately, it means that families with kids get to fly once every blue moon, and someone like me is probably underusing the budget, so I could probably sell my carbon credits on to other people. Or we decide as a society that we just want a society where people have the option to fly. And so we have to go harder on cutting emissions elsewhere to enable that people to have that choice to them.
Really interesting point. I'm reminded of the fact that I think it was a BP PR campaign that came up with the phrase carbon footprint and successfully made us all feel as consumers that it's our responsibility. But just picking up on that last point, I mean, if we decide that aviation is just a really, really sticky sector, one that is just really hard to deal with, and decarbonise really rapidly elsewhere, is that enough, Kate? Or do you think the numbers just suggest that that simply isn't enough?
Yeah, I think the latter, unfortunately. I mean, we've got this commitment now globally. I think there was mention earlier, UK, we could just we could really sacrifice all our, all the things we love in the UK, and everyone else would just kind of carry on doing their emissions, and so we wouldn't achieve what we want to globally. I don't think there's evidence for that happening. Almost every country in the world signed the Paris Agreement on climate change. The aviation industry itself now is committed to achieving net zero by 2050. For what that commitment's worth. So I think we're in a situation now where every country and every sector has to get as close to absolute zero emissions as possible in 30 years. And to the extent that that's not possible, and it's very unlikely to be possible for some sectors, aviation's one of maybe 2 or 3 sectors where that's very unlikely to be possible. And then we're going to have to do some really kind of some of the stuff that no one likes talking about in terms of greenhouse gas removals and those kind of engineered carbon removals from the atmosphere in order to get this net zero level. We just haven't got the sort of slack in the system, I suppose, that we might have thought we had even sort of 10 years ago, when there was lots of interesting kind of intellectual debate about tradable carbon quotas and all that kind of thing.
Carbon budgets are interesting and a good point. It's a really good point. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, gave 2.3 tonnes as a figure globally that we should each individually be emitting over a course of a year. Now, almost everything we do in our Western lifestyles takes us above that amount. Heating your home would take you above 2.3 tonnes over the course of a year. Driving your car, on average, eating meat if you eat meat. These are the things we do here in the UK. So given that every single one of those individually already takes us over our carbon budget, there is no room for flights. That's the stark reality of it. Obviously, we want to be talking about how we can still have flights in our lives. Because, of course, as you say, people live across the world from their families now. And it's, we're long past the time when we would wave our children off on a boat to Australia and never see them again. Of course, isn't it good that doesn't happen anymore? but we have to be realistic. And actually, in answer to your question about the kind of budget of how often can I fly, there have been studies done that gives the figure of 1 short-haul flight every 5 years and 1 long-haul flight every 8 years, and that's the reality of it. Sorry, guys.
Thank you, Anna. I think there are maybe sort of 2 things that I get from this. We're nearly at time, but just to sort of think about kind of where we are, I feel that Andy sort of filled us with some optimism about the future. But I wonder if one way of thinking about this is almost as if we're in wartime, we're in this sort of collective crisis, and perhaps there is an argument to be made that the public has to play its part in putting pressure on the government to bring some change here, and part of that is by thinking about how much we demand flying and how often we fly, and what we feel about flying. And there is perhaps an argument for a collective sacrifice to be made in the short term until one of those electric planes or hydrogen-powered planes can actually take off. Thanks very much to all our panelists tonight, to Kate, Anna, and Andy. Brilliant. Thank you so much.